Welcome to the Legal Influence Podcast, a show for influencers and content creators looking to grow thriving and influential businesses legally. I'm your host, Kate Cooper. I'm a Colorado attorney, an outdoor content creator, and blogger, and I started the Legal Influence to provide accessible legal education to creators. In today's episode, I'm going to talk all about what to consider when setting your rates as an influencer or content creator. But before I dive in, I do have to provide some quick disclaimers. Nothing I share today should be considered legal advice. Everything is for informational and educational purposes only. While I am an attorney, I am not your attorney, and listening to this episode does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and I. So I'm going to be honest, setting rates as an influencer can be one of the most difficult parts of the job because there are so many different variables that can go into calculating your rate. And some of those variables are going to be different with every campaign. So it can be challenging to figure out what an appropriate rate is. Also, remember, different brands have different budgets, and those budgets can vary dramatically. And you may or may not know what a brand's budget is. So I think it's really important for creators to be able to set their own rates based on all of the important details of the partnership. Ultimately, it's going to be up to you to decide whether or not you want to accept the terms of a partnership, and that includes the rate. That's honestly probably the most important piece of the puzzle for you. So I want you to have a general framework to help you calculate a fair rate. And I think there's a lot of really bad and outdated advice on there that really undervalues creators, and I'm here to stop that so that creators can be paid fairly. Keep in mind, your rate should always be flexible. Again, it should be aligned with the scope of the campaign, but there are a lot of different things to consider, and you may want to adjust your rate depending on the brand that you're working with, depending on other factors. So I don't think you should ever have a set rate that is the end-all be-all. Now, if you want to have a minimum rate that you're willing to accept, I think that's totally cool. And I think knowing that number for yourself can be a really helpful tool when it comes to negotiating and discerning whether a partnership is worth it for you or not. So the first thing that I want to discuss is setting your base rate. And when I talk about the base rate, I'm talking about the rate for an influencer to post on social media. Now, there might be some extras to factor into the overall rate, like usage rights or exclusivity, but we're going to discuss those later in the episode. So when it comes to setting your base rate, I want to bust the myth that influencers should be charging 1% of their following as their base rate for a post. That is extremely old and outdated advice that might have been relevant back in 2015, 2016, but times have certainly changed. Not only has the influencer marketing industry evolved, but everything is more expensive, and average rates for influencers have also gone up, especially for nano and micro and even mid-tier influencers. That 1% advice might still be relevant for a macro creator with 1 million plus followers, but there would need to be other considerations at play because your follower count alone isn't the only thing that you should consider when you're setting a base rate. It doesn't tell the whole story. You should also take your engagement into account along with how much reach your posts get on average. A creator with 10,000 followers who is regularly getting more than 10,000 views with really high engagement rates should have a higher base rate than somebody with 10,000 followers but low views and low engagement. So let's talk some numbers, because if 1% is too low, what is a good percentage? And keep in mind, you don't have to use a percentage of your total followers, but it's a simple way to calculate a base rate. And that's what a lot of creators use. So that percentage is going to vary, again, depending on those additional factors like engagement and average reach. But in general, I think anywhere from 2 to 5% of your following is appropriate. And again, we're talking about influencer campaigns, depending on your engagement, reach, and some of the other considerations I'm about to share. So another big thing to consider when setting your base rate is the product or brand that you're promoting and whether or not your audience is the target market for that product or brand. For example, I'm an outdoor creator. So if I'm promoting a tent to my audience of outdoorsy people who enjoy camping, that's going to be a lot more beneficial to the brand than if a beauty influencer with the same stats as me was promoting that tent. So if you have a very niche audience and you're working with a brand in that niche, then you might want to bump that base rate a little higher than you would for a more generic type of product. The next thing to consider is your experience level and the production quality of your content. If you've been a creator for years or you're a highly experienced photographer with professional gear, you should be charging significantly more than a newbie creator who takes all their photos on an iPhone. Now, that's not to say that the newbie creator's content isn't valuable. It is. It just means that the experienced photographer or the experienced creator who's putting a higher level of production into their content or has successful past brand deals under their belt is going to be in a position to charge more and be able to justify that higher rate. The next thing to consider are your production costs. In other words, the direct costs associated with creating the content. And this includes your time. Not all content is created equal. Depending on the campaign, you might be putting significant time and expense into creating content. You might need to travel, you might need props, you might need to pay fees. All of those expenses should be factored into your rate. Typically, video content is going to be more time consuming than photo content, so you may also want to adjust the rate based on the type of post that you're making. And you may not know what all of your expenses may be up front, but if the brand gives you a really good brief, you're going to have a good sense of the type of time and expense that will likely go into creating the content. And you also know how long it takes you to typically create content. For example, I know that a lot of recipe bloggers spend days testing out different recipes before they even get to the point of filming or shooting the content for a campaign. So you want to take all that time and expense into account when setting that base rate. So the last two considerations when it comes to setting a base rate that I'm going to discuss have to do with the brand that you're working with and the campaign itself. So first, if you're promoting a sin product, then you may want to charge a premium for that campaign. So what is a sin product? These are things like alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, gambling. Now, it's worth noting that different social media platforms often have policies around promoting these types of products. So you want to make sure you check the terms of the platform. Ideally, a brand should know that information, whether or not they can advertise on a particular platform. And they should never be asking you to do something that violates a platform's terms, but you just never know. But the reason you may want to charge a premium is because there's a little risk associated with promoting those types of products. You're putting your stamp of approval behind it. Now, depending on the product or your niche, that may not be a big deal. If you regularly share yourself enjoying wine, partnering with a vineyard is probably not going to shock your audience. But in general, promoting any sort of sin product might impact how people view you and your reputation. And so you might want to factor that into your base rate. The last consideration is whether the campaign is trying to capitalize on your identity. And I think a really good example of this would be a brand hiring an LGBTQ plus creator for a Pride campaign in June, or a brand that is trying to highlight their commitment to a certain cause that you talk a lot about on your social media. In these situations, the brand is getting additional goodwill from partnering with you. They're benefiting from your identity in a way that goes above and beyond the typical use of an influencer's image and likeness. So a campaign like that warrants a higher base rate. Now, up until this point, we have only been talking about your base rate. So now let's talk about the extra things that you can charge for above and beyond that base rate. This includes things like usage rights, whitelisting rights, exclusivity, and a couple of other things. I want you to look at all of these as extras and valuable assets that you can provide to a brand above and beyond creating content and sharing it on social media. And so because these are extra pieces of value, you should be compensated for those things above and beyond your base rate. Now, you're probably going to want to use your base rate as a tool to help you calculate what you should charge for some of these things. It's going to help you simplify that math. And that's one of the reasons why taking the time to figure out your base rate is so valuable. But you don't have to price things the way that I'm about to explain. At the end of the day, you get to price yourself however you want as a creator. So the first extra that I want to discuss are paid usage rights. So this is the right for the brand to use your content in paid advertising. This gives the brand the right to directly profit from the use of your content. So it's very valuable. And when it comes to paid usage rights, you can typically charge anywhere from 30 to 75% of your base rate per month of usage. And the reason that there's so much room for flexibility here is because the value of a month of paid usage shouldn't be contingent upon a creator's following or engagement or those other factors that go into a base rate. So somebody with a lower base rate, which is what most smaller influencers or UGC creators are going to have, should be charging a higher percentage of that base rate when calculating paid use to make sure that they're being compensated fairly. So let me give you an example. Let's say you have 10,000 followers. Your base rate is $500. That's 5% of your following. And let's say you've been listening to all the people out there who are telling you to charge 20 to 25% of your base rate per month for paid use. That would be $100 to $125 a month. And that would be a steal for the brand for a month of paid use, because during that time, the brand could put tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars in ad spend behind that content if they wanted to. So $100, $125 is not really a fair rate, whereas 75% would put you at, $400, which, to be honest, is still fairly low, but it's at least a little bit more appropriate. Now, let's say on the other end of the spectrum, you have 1 million followers and your base rate is $20,000. That's 2% of your following. That means that a month of paid use at 20 to 25% is $4,000 to $5,000 per month of paid use. That is a fair rate. But again, I know I'm not talking to macro influencers with millions of followers here. I'm talking to nano and micro and mid-tier influencers, along with UGC creators who have lower base rates. So I want you charging a higher percentage. Now, I also want to note that this percentage of your base rate equation is just the most common way to calculate paid usage, but that's not the only option out there. Personally, I'd like to see royalty payments start to become industry standard. So if a brand puts more money behind a piece of content, the creator ends up getting a bigger piece of the pie. And again, that means that it's not contingent on the creator's following or base rate. The rate that the creator is getting at the end of the day is based on how well that piece of content performed and how much ad spend the brand threw behind it. So next up, let's talk about whitelisting. This is also known as Spark ads on TikTok. Sometimes it's referred to as allow listing, but this is when a brand runs ads behind a piece of content posted to your social media account. So it looks like the ad is coming from your account, but the brand is paying for it. Now, for whitelisting rights, I would charge anywhere from 50 to 100% of your base rate per month. Again, consider the size of your base rate and the potential scope of the campaign when figuring that percentage out. And the reason that this is higher than just paid usage rights is because the brand is getting access to your social media real estate and capitalizing on your name and image. And you don't have control over the audience the brand is showing those ads to. So you could potentially be opening yourself up to hate or harassment. And so whitelisting rights should be priced at a premium. Next, let's talk about exclusivity. Now, this can be hard to price because you're trying to figure out the potential lost revenue that you might incur when you agree to an exclusivity provision, where essentially you're agreeing not to work with certain brands for a certain period of time. And here you can charge anywhere from 10 to 50+% of your base rate per month of exclusivity. The biggest thing to consider is the scope of the exclusivity. Are we talking about one brand that you don't want to work with anyways? Or is this an entire category of products that you typically promote? If you're potentially losing out on a significant amount of additional income, you can justify using a higher rate. So the next thing to consider when setting rates is the timeline for the campaign. And if the brand wants you to turn around content super quickly, like they send you product on Monday and they want you to have the content to them by Friday, you probably want to charge a rush fee for your content because you're prioritizing expediting the content for the brand. And so you want to charge a bit of a rush fee. You can figure out what that is for you, but that's something that you may want to charge the brand a little extra for. The next extra to consider is the length of your payment terms. So for example, if you have a contract that gives the brand a net 60 pay period, you might want to add a little extra to your rate to account for the fact that you're going to be waiting multiple months after finishing your work to get paid. Now, this is something that you might not know about during negotiations when you're initially calculating your rate. You typically don't know the brand's payment terms before you see a contract. But if you get your contract and you see you have a really long pay period and you want to try to negotiate that down, you could potentially ask for a net 30 pay period, or alternatively, let the brand know that you charge an additional fee for a net 60 period just to cover that burden of you having to wait so long to get paid. So the last thing to consider when setting your rate is the total value of your compensation package. So what are you getting beyond financial compensation? Now, free products that you need to create the content itself should not be a substitute for financial compensation, but there are a lot of ways that a brand can potentially provide you with additional value in the event they have a limited budget. I once worked on a UGC campaign where that was exactly the situation. The brand had a flat budget for what they could pay me, and it wasn't an unfair rate for the terms, but it was less than what I was charging other brands at the time. And because the financial budget was so tight, I was able to negotiate additional product. And it was a product that I genuinely really wanted and would have purchased myself. So it was worth it for me to be flexible with my rate. So take into consideration your total financial compensation. Also consider the potential tax implications. So typically products, services, and experiences over a certain value are going to be considered taxable income, but that's something that you're always going to want to talk to your CPA about when it comes time for taxes next year. But yeah, that is the last thing to consider when you set your rate. And keep in mind, again, there's no one right or wrong way to set a rate as an influencer or creator. It really should be tailored to specifically what the brand is looking for. So for example, in this situation, we were talking about the base rate for one post. Let's say the brand wants to do 3 posts. You might bundle that and offer a certain discount because you're providing multiple posts. So there's a lot of ways to get creative when you're calculating your rate. So I really hope this episode got your wheels turning when it comes to setting your rates. You may feel like you're in a good place right now. And if you are, I'm so happy for you. But perhaps after listening to this, you realize that you might be undercharging a little bit. I personally think that one of the best ways to assess whether you might be undercharging or not is by looking at how brands are responding when you give them your rate. If they're always agreeing to a rate without pushback or negotiating, that's going to be the best sign that you have that it's time to raise those rates. So thanks so much for listening to the Legal Influence podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, I would love for you to do me a favor, screenshot the episode and share it to your Instagram story, tagging at the Legal Influence. Also, be sure to leave a rating and review. And if you know any influencers or content creators who would benefit from this episode, please send it on to them. That really helps to grow the show. Thanks so much. Talk to you soon.